I'm gonna start this video off by saying Breaking Bad is a near flawless show. I've watched it 6 or 7 times, and if you think it's a masterpiece, I mostly agree with you. But I'm just tired of seeing people call it the greatest piece of fiction ever made or a completely flawless masterpiece that's immune to criticism. So here are 5 of my biggest, in-depth, evidence-backed critiques of Breaking Bad. Saul Goodman, introduced in Season 2, Episode 8, Better Call Saul, is one of my favorite characters, but despite how entertaining he is, Saul's role in the story repeatedly undermines Breaking Bad's commitment to realism and internal logic. Too often he functions as a narrative crutch. Breaking Bad was written episode to episode, and that creative process occasionally backed the writers into corners. As a result, Saul often serves a specific narrative purpose. Saul exists to get the writers out. Whenever the plot hits a wall, Saul just knows a guy. He becomes a walking Deus Ex Machina, a shortcut disguised as a character.
I got a guy who knows this guy who knows this Rain Man type.
For example, the money laundering scheme through Walt Jr.'s website. When Walt needs a way to launder his drug money, the solution is absurd. Saul just happens to know a hyper-specialized international hacker from Belarus who can hack thousands of computers worldwide to generate tens of thousands of untraceable donations.
Wait. He's a hacker cracker extraordinaire.
Not only is that wildly implausible, it's laughably convenient. Saul doesn't solve the problem, the plot hands him a miracle. And an even more ridiculous example is the vacuum repair guy. The show asks us to accept that there exists a man whose entire job is erasing criminals' identities, relocating them, and giving them new lives. Saul just casually whips out his business card whenever the plot demands. Saul even says,
I don't even know the guy's name.
"What? You're telling me Saul is trusting Walt and his entire family's lives on a guy's name he doesn't know, but deeply trusts because of plot?" And then there's Jimmy In and Out. When Heisenberg needs someone to go to jail in his place, Saul once again knows a guy who repeatedly goes to prison on purpose. Saul even says
He likes prison.
and will give up years of his life for only $30,000. Saul basically acknowledges how ridiculous this is, which feels like the writers acknowledging the problem rather than fixing it.
For a price, Jimmy will go to prison for you.
On purpose? The guy goes to prison on purpose.
Better Call Saul attempts to explain why Saul knows so many hyper-specific people, but since this video analyzes Breaking Bad in isolation, those after-the-fact explanations are irrelevant to my argument. Even the most devoted Breaking Bad fans have to admit the Saul knows a guy thing becomes lazy over time. This is so well known, in fact, it's become a massive meme. Saul arbitrarily supplies whatever the plot demands, whenever it demands it. Saul is still a fantastic character, but as a narrative device, he's often used as the easy way out. And yes, Mike also solves problems, but Mike earns his solutions through groundwork and consequence. Saul's solutions appear out of thin air, and that difference matters.
I was indispensable. I kept Walter White out of jail.
Following the death of Gus, Season 5 opens with a major problem. Gus's laptop, which contains hundreds of hours of incriminating footage, has been seized by the DEA. Walt, Mike, and Jesse need it destroyed, and the solution the show gives us, the magnet plan, is frankly embarrassing. The plan is to park a box truck fitted with a massive electromagnet outside a police station and simply hope the magnetic field penetrates a reinforced concrete wall and destroys Gus's specific laptop somewhere in the evidence room. And yes, Mike calls the station pretending to be a postal inspector, but all he confirms is that the DEA has it and which building it's in. Not the room, not the locker, just the building. So with almost zero real information, they go ahead with the plan. A plan that is at best 1,000,000 to 1. Vince Gilligan himself admitted the magnet plot was never created to stand up to actual science and was invented purely for dramatic effect. It's scientifically impossible, confirmed by the creator, but what really breaks it is that the plan completely contradicts Walter White's character. Walt is not an idiot who takes unnecessary risks. For example, he orders the murder of Gus's men because they might snitch. He poisons Brock as a contingency plan. The magnet plan, in contrast, makes Walt look extremely stupid. Walt's test for the plan is a crude demonstration where an underpowered magnet destroys a test laptop, after which the group celebrates as Walt arbitrarily demands more magnet power.
Can you add 21 more wired in parallel, up the amperage?
with no calculations, no further testing, and no consideration for real-world variables. The tests never take into account the reinforced concrete and steel of the evidence room, as well as hundreds of other metal objects that would interfere with the magnetic field. Walt isn't solving a problem, he's guessing. What makes this even worse is that the plan succeeds, and the show undercuts itself when Hank later says,
You know, I sneaked a peek before APD took it out of Fring's office. The whole thing was encrypted. Maybe they wouldn't have got anything anyway, but...
offering a far more believable explanation for why no footage was recovered. This line proves how ultimately pointless the whole charade actually was. Walt's own justification,
It worked.
Why?
Because I say so.
might reflect his ego-driven hubris after killing Gus, but that doesn't explain why Mike, whose initial reaction is to leave town, goes along with the plan. Throughout the entire series, Mike's defining trait is his careful, methodical professionalism. He scouts locations before using them. He plans contingencies. He opposes reckless, emotion-driven decisions. We've seen him warn Jesse against impulsive revenge. We've watched him execute Gus's orders with military precision. Not to mention, Mike's whole philosophy is no half measures. Remember his speech to Walt.
I chose a half measure when I should have gone all the way. I'll never make that mistake again.
The magnet plan, however, is the definition of a half measure, untested and purely hopeful. Even if Mike is desperate enough, why doesn't he insist on doing it properly? Where's the reconnaissance? Where's the proper testing? Why does Mike, whose entire character is built on no half measures, abandon those principles here? Mike isn't a character who develops through Breaking Bad. He's a character who stabilizes the story. And when he accepts a half-assed, ludicrous plan, the problem isn't the plan, it's the writing. The magnet plan isn't smart, planned, or tested. It's a spectacle masquerading as intelligence, and it asks the audience to accept a plan that is all risk, no reward, and fundamentally contradicts Walt and Mike's characters. The crash of Wayfere Flight 515 is, in my opinion, one of the single most damaging creative decisions to Breaking Bad's otherwise grounded narrative. While it's obviously meant to explore the idea that actions have consequences, even unintended ones, the way the show executes the consequences is massively overblown and stretches credibility far past its breaking point. Breaking Bad is at its best when it stays grounded. Plausible crime, realistic power dynamics, and consequences that grow naturally out of character choices. It's a story about a high school chemistry teacher becoming a drug kingpin, not a story about cosmic, world-altering disasters. Even though the crash requires a super unlikely chain of events, my main issue is that it's a structural anomaly within the story. The crash killed 167 people. Let me put that number into perspective. Across the entirety of Breaking Bad, every single death Walt directly or indirectly causes totals to roughly 40 to 50 people. The plane crash alone kills more than 3 times everyone else combined. And here's the problem. The show never comes remotely close to this extreme scale again. The second largest loss of life in the entire show, the prison murders, is only at 10 deaths. That's 16 times smaller than Wayfere 515. So the show's consequences look like this. Individual deaths in season 1, then suddenly 167 deaths in season 2, and then right back down to individual small group deaths for season 3 through 5. That's not escalation, it's a clear spike in consequence that the show immediately abandons, making it a clear anomaly. And it's not a natural consequence of Walt's actions either. It's a thematic shortcut. The crash exists to force a butterfly effect message rather than earn one organically. Even worse, the story moves on almost immediately. Walt struggles for just a few episodes, and then the crash is just forgotten. It's not even mentioned a single time in season 4 and 5. A far more grounded chain of events would have been Walt letting Jane die, then Donald committing suicide like he does in season 3, and this suicide deeply haunts Walt for the rest of the series, a personal, enforceable punishment for Walt's sin. Instead, the show gives us 167 nameless, faceless deaths, and then moves on within 3 episodes. And yes, the fans argue it's the ultimate butterfly effect, which is true, but symbolism doesn't excuse narrative weightlessness. If you're going to introduce a catastrophe at that scale, the story has to bear its weight, which it doesn't. The teddy bear eye keeps appearing in later seasons, almost like the show trying to remind us that this mattered. But symbolism replaces substance. The symbol of the crash lingers around longer than the actual consequence of the crash. The show doesn't live with the fallout of the disaster it created. In the end, Wayfere 515 turns a personal moral failure into a statistically impossible global disaster. It feels less like an earned consequence and more like a forced metaphor, one that stands out statistically in the grounded storytelling that makes Breaking Bad great in the first place.
Oh no, they're shooting at us!
Good thing bad guys are such terrible shots.
Man, these guys are elusive.
The introduction of Jack Walker's gang in Season 5 is, in my opinion, a narratively regressive choice. Their presence marks a shift away from Breaking Bad's tradition of complex, morally ambiguous antagonists and towards something far simpler, disposable villains. The show's best antagonists, Tuco, Gus, even at certain points Mike, were defined by clear motivations and internal logic. Their villainy wasn't illogical, it was rooted in professional pride, business interests, or a warped ethical code. They felt human, which made them threatening. Tuco specifically is chaotic, but has a childlike playfulness and a deep loyalty to his family, not to mention his almost wholesome respect for the elderly. Jack's gang, by contrast, is cartoonishly evil.
I see a kid with a bicycle helmet on, I want to smack the shit out of him, like for his own good.
They exist almost entirely as moral cannon fodder. There's no meaningful character depth, no interior lives, and no complexity beyond surface level white supremacist ideology and greed. They shoot Andrea without a second thought. They enslave Jesse and think it's funny. They execute Hank and don't blink. They're not characters so much as functions. And that becomes obvious in how they're used. The gang exists to facilitate improbably efficient and illogical plot mechanics to move the story forward. Most notably, the 10 prison murders in 2 minutes, and to make decisions that are completely illogical, just to set the stage.
Let me set the stage for you here.
Jack's gang executes Hank in front of Walt, then steals all 80 million of Walt's money. But then Jack gives Walt 12 million back as a professional courtesy because Todd respects him.
Pull a barrel out the truck, load it in the Chrysler.
Jack, that's like 10 or 11 million right there. You sure you want to do that?
You gonna make me say it again? Go, chop, chop. Jesus, what's with all the greed here?
I'm leaving you a barrel.
My nephew here, he respects you.
These are the stated reasons, but they don't make any sense. They had just murdered Hank, giving Walt maximum motivation for revenge, and now they're funding his revenge with millions of dollars. Todd's respect doesn't outweigh that risk. Similarly, they keep Jesse alive so they can make more money and so that Todd can learn how to cook. Jack even says,
Meth? Who gives a shit about meth? We won the lottery here. We've got all the money in the world. You're talking to me about selling crank?
No matter how much you got, how do you turn your back on more?
but they already have 80 million and Jesse constantly tries to escape. The justification of perfect meth cooking and more money doesn't outweigh Jesse's obvious liability. Plus, if they're so greedy, why would Jack give Walt the 12 million back?
Now think about that. That does not make sense.
The real reason behind both decisions? The plot requires Walt to have money in the final and for Jesse to be alive in the final. Jack's gang makes choices that serve narrative convenience, not internal logic. The common defense for Jack's gang is that this was necessary because Walt had become the true villain. But that argument misses what made Breaking Bad work in the first place. The show's strength was never traditional hero versus villain conflict. It was always internal, rational tension. Walt versus Jesse, Walt versus Hank, Walt versus himself. Antagonists like Gus were meant to expose Walt's moral decay, not excuse it. It also doesn't work because Walt's final arc is redemptive rather than regressive, making it obvious that Jack's gang exists purely to make Walt look good in comparison, not functioning as actual villains. By introducing Jack's gang, a group that is unambiguously and excessively evil, the narrative gives Walt a moral alibi. Their actions, especially the murder of Hank and enslavement of Jesse, lower the moral bar so far that Walt's final act of violence can be framed as justified, even redemptive. Instead of facing the full weight of his own villainy, Walt is allowed to conveniently end the story by killing people who are clearly worse than him. The result is a simplified ending, one that trades Breaking Bad's signature moral ambiguity for a more conventional feel-good climax. It's effective on a surface level, but it sacrifices a nuance that once made the show exceptional. The finale of Breaking Bad largely succeeds at wrapping up its major narrative threads. However, the method Walter White uses in his final act, the M60 machine gun turret, introduces a major credibility issue and a clear inconsistency with his established character. I understand that Walt was in a vengeful and violent state of mind, but that doesn't excuse that the idea itself isn't believable. Without ever testing the mechanism or even visiting Jack's compound beforehand, the plan's success depends almost entirely on blind luck. Everything has to go right, the exact parking spot must be available, the gun must fire at the perfect height, and the gang must all be lined up like a shooting gallery, and no one reacts quickly enough to escape or take cover. The plan also carries enormous risk. Walt could be executed by Jack immediately. Jesse could be killed if things don't go exactly right. Or, hilariously, Jack's gang could have a basement. Imagine Walt goes through all this effort just to be taken to a fucking basement. Walt's level of uncertainty makes sense purely from a desperation point of view, but seems to contradict Walter White's established meticulous planning. The M60's brilliance is asserted, not demonstrated. Throughout the series, Walt's main engineering schemes required collaboration. The train heist, the magnet plan, these needed Mike, Jesse, and others, and Walt has pulled off some solo engineering. For example, the battery in the desert or escaping Mike's handcuffs. But when Walt works alone, under life or death pressure, he always resorts to chemistry. Not guns, not brute force, but chemical solutions that leverage his expertise. He stole the methylamine barrel using thermite. He dissolved multiple bodies in acid. The entire fucking show is built on the idea that chemistry isn't just what Walt does, it's who he is. He dies in the chemistry lab. And I notice a very important pattern. Whenever Walt is backed into a corner, he always resorts to chemistry. And the more desperate his situation becomes, the more elaborate the chemical solutions get. When his life is threatened by Emilio, he creates phosphine gas as a survival reaction, saving his and Jesse's lives. When he needed to retrieve his stolen meth and avenge Jesse, he created fulminated mercury, infiltrated and blew up Tuco's compound, earning Tuco's respect and launching his descent into the criminal underworld. And Walt's absolute most desperate moment, when his entire family's lives are in danger, did he simplify his approach with desperate, untested luck? No. He orchestrates his most complex chemical/manipulative scheme ever, poisoning Brock to manipulate Jesse, building a chemical bomb strapped to a wheelchair, and exploiting Gus's history with Hector Salamanca. Chemistry isn't just his skill set, it's his psychological security blanket, the one thing that makes him feel in control when everything else is chaos. And it's not like Walt lost his capability. In the finale, he secretly poisons Lydia with ricin, the same ricin he created back in season 4. Walt returned to his abandoned house, retrieves chemistry from his past, and brings it specifically to execute a chemical assassination. He goes out of his way, takes additional risk to use a chemistry-based method for Lydia, while simultaneously planning a Rambo-style massacre for Jack's gang. The ricin isn't just proof Walt's still capable, it's proof the writers intentionally maintained his chemistry identity in the same episode they abandoned it. Someone might argue Walt's suicidal and reckless, but this isn't true. Walt isn't suicidal, he's terminal. Accepting death is near is not the same as abandoning control, and Walter White never abandons control. He gets $9 million to Walt Jr. He tells Skyler he did it for me, and only asks Jesse to shoot him after he had been struck by the stray bullet. Those are all final acts of control. The M60 is the opposite of control, untested and a Hail Mary. Walt spends the entire finale asserting control over his legacy, his family, and his death, and then bets everything on an untested, out-of-control M60 plan. The M60 is pure brute and blind luck. It pretends to be clever engineering, but is actually just fireworks. That shift is narratively weak, especially given that the M60 itself was introduced visually in the season 5 premiere, before the writers had even decided how it would be used in the final. All this proves is that the ending was built around a striking image of a machine gun rather than an organic extension of Walt's character. The problem isn't that Walt kills Jack's gang, it's the method he chooses contradicts the way he's always solved problems under pressure. Ideally, Walt's ending should have returned to his roots as a chemist, and given us a conclusion that reflected the same kind of chemical ingenuity that defined every major character moment throughout the entire series. Instead, the series ends with a militarized rampage that was completely untested and feels more like shooting in the dark rather than brilliance. It's a satisfying moment on a visceral level, but it's not the smartest one. And for a character like Walter White, that distinction matters. I personally think Breaking Bad is one of the greatest shows ever made, and it's one of my personal favorites. And my video isn't meant to shit on the show or act like it's bad. My only point is that even a show as great as Breaking Bad isn't completely flawless, like a ton of fans believe it to be. and has some weak villains, major plot conveniences, and forced metaphors. Instead of a 10 out of 10 flawless masterpiece, I think it's around a 9 out of 10 extremely solid show with minor mistakes. Thanks for watching, subscribe or something, I don't know.